One of the films screening at this year's Melbourne Documentary Film Festival is a film called Who Would You Tell? And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the director of Who Would You Tell, Dery Sultana. Dery, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much.
And as you were just telling me, we're speaking to you from an island off the coast of Sicily.
Yes, I'm on a short break.
Ah, how lovely. Now, let's talk about Who Would You Tell, because this is such a really interesting film based on a very difficult topic about the way, in particular, Maltese immigrants children were treated so badly in the orphanages in Australia. Tell me about the origins of this film. What made you decide to make it?
Originally it started, I was on a train going to work, and my sister sent me a text to a link of an article on a Maltese newspaper, which had a part of a testimony from the Royal Commission from a Maltese kid who was part of the scheme. And my sister told me, oh, this is a really interesting topic. I never knew there were kids, Maltese kids, sent to Australia. I read it and I said, oh, neither did I. So then I started, doing some research, and the topic of abuse and stuff like that, I have tackled it before when I used to work on television in Malta, and we investigated similar activities in orphanages and abuse. So, it piqued my attention, and since I didn't know about these child migrants, I said, this could be, there could be grounds for a documentary. Then I went down the path, which took me 5 years to come where we are.
How interesting. And so I suppose you needed some financing and support to be able to make this film.
Yeah. Originally, the story started off as a short documentary. That's what I had in mind. It started as a short documentary, and I applied for some funds from the Malta Film Funds for a short documentary about the child migrants. But the more I digged and the more material I started to gather, I ended up with over 13 hours of material that I, concise, and it's turned out to be 70 minutes.
How interesting. Now, what happened in Australia, and it's not just Maltese immigrants, but other children that came from the UK and some other places were put into orphanages because of the war, because of economic upheaval and bombings and all that sort of thing that had happened, were similarly treated quite badly. But your focus is, of course, on the Maltese children who came to Australia. How did you find the men who were willing to talk to you about their experiences?
So when I was reading this article I told you about that inspired my story, I contacted my friend Ramon Mitzi, who's the producer and writer on this documentary. And I was telling him about the idea about the documentary. And then he said, oh, it's a really good idea. He said, I was considering doing something similar when I was in the UK about the same scheme. And so then we started wondering how we're going to find the right people to tell the story. And we said, we have to find some of these kids. And a bracket here, I still call them kids, even though they're 70 years old. Mm. And, and we were discussing and talking how to find these kids without realizing that the first comment on this portal, on the newspaper portal, I was reading this article, there was Manny commenting, a guy called Manny commenting about, oh, this story is true. He's my brother. I was there too. I was abused too, and stuff like that. So then I said, oh, we have to find this Manny. And I went into, clicking on links, searching Manny and abuse and stuff. And somewhere I found an email, and I contacted this Manny. And then he gave me the contact of Rayfil. Then I contacted Rayfil. And a very interesting thing was that Rayfil made one condition. He gave me full access to his story to one condition. And the condition was never put me in the same room with Manny. I don't want to speak to Manny, to my brother. And that, raised, suddenly made this documentary a bit more interesting. Why does these two brothers who went through hell, they don't want to speak to each other? So then I started digging and digging and digging. And like from my experience from tackling this subject in the past, there's always an element of skepticism in these stories, and people who don't believe that these things actually happened. Like still, even here in Italy, at the moment I'm in Italy and I was, at a festival, they still believe that the church cannot do this. Like these things don't happen. They try to deny that this abuse can happen. And I was very aware of this side of the story, and I wanted it featured. And to us, I call it a stroke of luck. When I went to the institute to film in Tardil, in the institution, I met a third brother who came with them, which was the eldest one. And he happened to be a skeptic that doesn't believe that this thing happened. So suddenly I had all the elements I needed, the antagonist, the protagonist, all within the same family, which makes, again, I think, gives another more layer of interest in the story, having the skeptic being their elder brother. And that's what brought the three brothers together. There was a fourth brother as well, and he's still alive, but he's mentally sick, partly because of the abuse. So we chose not to feature him and focus on just the three brothers.
Right. And that's what comes across so strongly in your film. I mean, it's quite incredible to think that priests and religious clergy, etc., would treat children in such a way. And yet there is, of course, so much evidence that presents that. How willing were these men to talk in depth about their experiences without censoring themselves or without being concerned that maybe they were saying too much?
I think they understood the importance that such stories need to be told. And the louder they're said, the more likely that the cycle is broken. Unfortunately, secrecy is the fuel for such abuse to keep happening and happening and happening. And the whole, even speaking to them, the whole notion of the priest, bribing them not to tell anyone, threatening them not to tell anyone. And again, when they would make the courage and talk about it, they would be reprimanded, punished, not believed. Like one of them went to the police to make a report about what was going on, and he just got a slap on the face and told him, "Don't you dare talk like that about the Christian men. These Christian men, they're there to help you." And it's yes, they did shut up for 50 years, and then finally, when they let it all out, all of them say what a relief it was, and yes, finally they made some sense of the abuse that they suffered.
Incredible. It is quite incredible. And was it only you there with the camera recording the interviews, or did you have a few other people with you?
No, Ramon, my partner, we're three. We are three people that made this film. There is me, Ramon Mitzi, and Alexis Mitzi, his brother. Ramon Mitzi is the producer, and as well he did a lot of the research, and line producing research and helped with the script. I wrote the script to structure it. Alexis Mitzi was the camera person and the technical guy who took care of all the imagery, and then we hired the drone people to help us with as you could see, it's full of drone footage, which the whole idea behind my vision behind it was always to show the beautiful Australia, the beautiful surrounding where it all happened, to contrast the horror that went on in there, and as well to show the contrast of Malta versus Australia. When you think about it, you can't, these kids, they're coming from a highly dense, like Malta, it's a claustrophobic in a beautiful sense. Like it's a tiny island, built, overpopulated, and then suddenly you end up in Tardin, where you just look around you and you see nothing. And it for me, it was just the contrast when I've been to Tardin versus when I think these young children, imagine plugging them from chaos and putting them in the middle of nowhere. And that was something I tried to capture with the imagery of contrasting between the Malta and Australia.
You certainly have done that, and it comes across so strongly, and it's hearing the stories is just absolutely incredible. I can imagine that were there any legal issues about presenting their stories, because there might still be some members of the church not happy about this?
Every word said was basically said in the Royal Commission, and it's documented in the Royal Commission. So it's all out there. It's all out there. It's basically retold what they said in the Royal Commission, both Manny and Rachel.
Yeah.
If anything, I added the part of Peter where he raises questions about, like, really, it was not that bad. I added a bit of the positive,
right,
from one side, if anything. That's how I see it.
Sure. No, I understand, to try and get a bit of balance, but really it was quite patent, the abuse that was being suffered. I can imagine that in the editing process, creating now a 70-minute documentary about this, with all the interviews that you had, and the drone footage, etc., that must have been quite a difficult task for you.
Very. This was the current edit is edit number 20. That's how many versions. And it was interesting because, where to start. The first, I would say, 2 minutes, they never changed from the first version until the end. How starting with Kevin Rudd giving the apology and acknowledging what a horrible story this is, because it is a horrible story. And I wanted to let the audience know that they're not in for a joyride with this movie. It is a very heavy story, which I actually lived through. I have a son, which was the age of Rachel when I started editing the doco. So when I could hear Rachel speak, I could see my son imagine if my son was there. So that it gave me a layer of, horror about the story. And yes, and then, so the first cut was a chronological, what I call from birth till death. Start from when they were born until the very end. And then you start making it a bit more interesting and start shuffling things around, making sense, and trying to find, engaging way how to keep the audience on the ball, asking questions, answering them, asking more questions, answering them, until you finally come to a resolution, which came from the Royal Commission itself. How much in the end they got the question is where, who would you tell? They told it to us, and in the end, they were believed. That's to summarize in a few words the journey of this documentary, I think.
Exactly. And of course, the subtext of that is, who could they tell at the time when it was happening to them? Because no one would believe them. Yes, exactly. I understand. It's interesting. I think you did some filming in Malta of some of the politicians, etc. I think, was it the president of Malta or the
prime minister? There was a prime minister,
yeah.
which is very interesting. This prime minister,
yeah,
his granduncle is the bishop responsible for sending the kids in Australia.
Right.
And he's the prime minister who gave the apology when time came many years later to recognize this reality.
Yes.
And yes, and I think he glued the story together pretty nicely, giving us context of how it happened and why it happened, then bringing us to today of acknowledging the abuse and making sure, not to paint a totally horrible picture, because not all kids were abused. And that is something which I did want to come along, because I didn't want to give the impression that these institutions were just bad. I've met again, I'm calling them kids. I met kids which went through the system and they were not abused. And they say that it's the best thing that happened to them. Amongst them, Peter, which is,
yeah.
But, it's with these things, there are the unlucky ones who crossed paths with the wrong person, say, like everything in life.
Yes, yes. And it's so interesting too, Malta being a very religious sort of country, very Catholic, I think, in orientation. And I suppose it would be so unbelievable for people from Malta to understand that in Australia we had religious people who were abusers, and that how could that possibly happen? Yeah.
It's abuse doesn't, I think perpetrators, I don't like to put priests as highlighting them as being, for example, the majority of pedophiles. I believe that it comes from every angle. Where there are kids, you're gonna find people who abuse kids, and because priests tend to work with kids, there are priests who are pedophiles. But the same goes with teachers. Same goes with anyone who has contact with kids, basically.
Yeah. No, I understand. So, who would you tell is now screening, or will be screening in July at the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival? How else will the film be screened, or where else has it been screened?
A week ago today, it was premiered in Italy, in Bologna as part of Biography Fest. And me and the other producer, Anton Calleja, he's another Maltese friend of ours, which ironically enough, me, Ramon, and Anton, we were in the same class when we were 11 years old. And we lost touch, and we connect on this movie 25, 30 years later. So that it's screened there, which is at the moment, it's still screening in the festival in Bologna. And the next one is my premiere in Australia at the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival.
How interesting. Will the film be screened in Malta?
Yeah, we're still trying to organize, trying to find out the best way. At the moment, we're doing the festival runs. I know that the moment I want it to be aired on TV, I am sure that I'll have no problem in getting it on. I already was approached by some TV stations which were interested in showing the show, but you know, first you do the festival runs, and then I still need to do another cut down of it to make it a 1 hour doco, because it's more sellable for TV as a 1 hour show rather than a feature. But again, it's hard to keep on chopping on it, I in my mind, every word in there has a reason for being there, and
I,
chopping sometimes becomes hard.
I understand. Yeah. Okay. How interesting to hear that. So tell me about your previous work. You said you worked in, did you say on television in Malta?
Yes, I used to work. I used to direct film and be part of this current affair show, which we touched many subjects, and amongst them, we touched the abuse. There was a case where 3 priests in an orphanage were serial perpetrators, where ultimately after our show aired and investigations were opened and the priest ended up in prison, which was which I think was a good outcome because a cycle was broken. And very interesting things, because these things were always kept under the carpet. I remember one time I was walking down Valletta, and a priest who I know stopped me after, it was the day after the show aired, and he stopped me and he told me, "You should be ashamed of you of telling the story and putting a bad image to the church," and no. I told him, if I were you, I would be ashamed being part of this organization, which is who's allowing and hiding these things. And many times it's a very common thing of moving perpetrators around, and rather than stopping them, you send them to do more harm somewhere else, which is really sad.
Yes, exactly. That happens so often, and we've had recent examples of that as well in many countries. So yeah. So Dery, are you working on another film or project or documentary or whatever at the moment?
I think at the moment I'm trying to get this one out there. And yes, I have other, I'm always on the lookout for stories, telling stories becomes part of you, and curiosity it's always there. We always ask questions, and and who would you tell? I would like to tell the audience my story. So,
and that's very good. And we should mention that with who would you tell? I think one of the men, one of the brothers, died after the film was completed.
Yes, 3 months after we filmed the documentary, I was very aware. Like one of the antagonists, when I was telling you about the antagonist, which is Peter, when I met him, he was, very an advanced stage of cancer. He refused to participate in the documentary because of his stutter, and he said, I can't appear on TV. I literally went down on my knees and told him, listen, I don't have a documentary if you don't participate in this. And he said, oh, he told me this, I would be a bastard if I say no to you. And he sat down and he gave me just 15 minutes of an interview, which 15 minutes if you had to reduce the stutter, because technically to edit a stutterer, I never thought it would be so difficult. Thank goodness I had 2 cameras. I left some of the stuttering there, but I really reduced a good 60% of the stutter in the interview, because otherwise it would have been frustrating for the viewer to watch.
Sure.
But
yeah.
I managed to still keep the stutter and give an idea when he started talking about the stutter by leaving more stutter in there. But it was a challenge. Editing, I think that was the biggest challenge in this documentary, is handling the technical detail of making it still delivering the character of the person, and without making the audience frustrated about following the story.
Yeah. No, I
but
understand.
he was a really, really nice person. He really helped me with the story. We kept in touch until the very end, until literally I sent him a message and he never replied, which was very sad. And he never got to see the documentary.
Yeah. No, I understand. Very sad. But the other brothers have seen it. Have they commented on it?
Actually, no, they haven't seen it yet.
Oh,
I have still to organize a screening for them, because I was, I was hoping for the festival, to have them seeing it in a theater at a screening, and I'm still to organize this. And I want, obviously I want them to see the final version, and the final version went through multiple editing. And it's only a few months ago that we really logged in the version that you just saw.
right. Okay, I understand. Be interesting to see how they do react, but how
Yes, I'm interested. I'm curious too, because
yeah,
there is a bit the element of surprise, because they none of them know what the other one said. So it was interesting, because the three of them, they had different, I always describe it's seeing the same object from different angles.
Yeah.
And if you're standing on one side of the street, you can say that this car was next to a red door. If you're standing on the other side of the street, you can say this car was next to a blue door.
Yes.
And they're both right. Even though they're saying sometimes the opposite, they are both right, because life is not black or white. There is a whole range of grays in the middle. And
exactly. And it's based so much on the way we perceive things, and we all perceive things very differently.
indeed, and as well, there is something which I acknowledge, and I tried a lot not to let my bias influence as well the story, because I'm a human being and I have an opinion and a view on these things and stuff. But I try to stay true to the facts as much as possible.
Yep.
And give equal exposure to both sides of the argument.
Of course, no, I understand. As an objective documentary filmmaker, that's the way you have to be. You have to step back from the material. Yeah, no, I understand. And just very finally, Dery, are there any particular maybe documentary films or filmmakers who perhaps you respect?
Oh, many, and especially when I see a documentary where it's like off the wall, where you get a story stitched from different interviews, and try to avoid having a narrator filling up and stitching it together, which is the easy way of doing things. I respect all those, because I know how hard it is.
I understand. Look, congratulations on Who Would You Tell, the documentary that's screening as part of the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival in July. And we've been speaking to the director of Who Would You Tell, Dery Sultana. Dery, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.